Describe the main idea behind Hafler Trio in 3 words.
3 words. uh, oh dear, 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 dear. Um, well, I'm trying not to come up with some clever answer because that's not right. Mm, okay, affirming, denying, reconciling.
Just out of curiosity, do you by any chance follow the work of Chris Watson?
No, no, I mean, no, I don't have any contact with him. I did some years ago because we were trying to re-release the early records, and he said no. No, I don't have any. No, I mean, I don't buy records, and I don't. I mean, he's basically written me out of his history. So,
In your opinion, has modern music stopped in its development?
well, I don't know very much about modern music, so uh, I honestly don't. I don't listen to music. Where I live, I don't even have speakers out in. I mean, the people that I live above would complain about the noise, so I don't even have speakers. Which is a bit of for someone who's supposed to be a sound engineer, this is a bit. So everything I do is on headphones, and these very old headphones, which are all broken. I have absolutely no idea. I mean, I really do not know what people are doing. Uh, so. I never hear this stuff. Nobody ever sends it to me. Nobody. I mean, and as I say, I don't even listen to music anyway. So I honestly don't know. All I can. I mean, all I can. The only useful thing I can say about it is related to what we talked about before. It's very easy for people to do this kind of stuff. It wasn't. It was very difficult to do all this kind of crazy stuff, and now anybody can do it. So obviously, you have many, many, many more people doing this kind of stuff, and some of it may be very interesting. I don't know. All I do know is that there are so many people doing it that, statistically speaking, most of it must be awful. So if you make something, I give you a concrete example from the past. I once had a very interesting conversation with a man called Jeff Travis, who used to run Rough Trade Records, and he said one of the weird things that happened was an invention called the Porter Studio, and the Porter Studio was a machine which recorded onto ordinary cassettes, but it recorded everything on one side, and you could record. It was like a 4-track tape recorder, so you could have a home studio for the very first time. People could actually make demos, as we used to call them, without going into a studio and spending a huge amount of money, because in those days that's what it took. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in those days, the idea was you would form a group, even if you were experimental. I mean, you would form some sort of group, you would do some sort of stuff, and then you would go into a studio and you would make what were called demos, so demonstration recordings. These were not intended to be released. These would be tapes that you would take to record companies, and you would try to get a record deal and make the record again properly, and the record company would pay for you to go into the studio and spend an enormous amount of money to make that record and then have that released, right? That's how it normally worked. Now, when the independent record companies came up, like Rough Trade, who were pretty much the major one, and this thing called the Porter Studio got invented, that meant that people didn't have to go to the demo studio. They could make their own. And what that did was, he said, that when that happened, they got 20 Joy Divisions a week, they got 3 Falls, and about 2 Cabaret Voltaires. So suddenly everybody started making records like the people that they listened to, because that's what you do when you learn to do anything. You copy people, right? When you're a child, you copy your parents. That's how you learn. Now, before that, nobody ever heard that because you couldn't afford that. And that used to knock a lot of people out of the game before they even tried. So a lot of people wouldn't even try to become a group because they knew they would never get a contract and they would never have the money to go into a studio. Suddenly, everybody could, or many, many people could do this. Now you have a situation where anybody can do this. And so consequently, it's very, very difficult to work out what's going on. So yes, on the positive side of things, you have an enormous amount of stuff and an enormous amount of people doing stuff. But on the negative side of things, you've got an enormous amount of stuff and an enormous amount of people doing it. So how do you judge? The people who are doing this never had to really try. They didn't have to put very much effort into it. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing. If you want to use the word natural selection, in the old days, natural selection killed off a lot of the people before they even got to that stage. So the people who made the records really wanted to make the records. But today, that's not the case. So it has changed the way that people make art, make creative acts. It has changed that fundamentally. Now, I'm not saying it's good and I'm not saying it's bad, but it's so different that I don't know. And so I can't answer your question because of that.
What's your take on today's young generation? What are some good and bad things about it, and how it is different from the young people of your times?
Well, I don't have very much contact with young people, but my impression is, I mean, when I was doing the workshops and stuff, I mean, I did come in contact with younger people, and they have too many choices. So it's related to what we just talked about, is that there is now so much that it's very difficult for people to tell what to do, which is, of course, great on the one hand, but how do you judge whether you've made the right choice or not? And before, if you got, and you come from a country where also there was no choice for a very long time, and I'm living in a country which not very long ago also had no choice. So having no choice is not good, but having infinite choice is also very bad, because how do you judge whether one thing is better for you than another? Well, what happens is that you choose to do one particular thing and you always think that you could do better somewhere else. So you're never satisfied. You always think, oh, if only I'd waited a couple of weeks, I could have gotten that computer a bit cheaper or a better one. Or if only I'd gone to this other shop, I could have got a better deal on this. If only I'd picked this other person, I would have a happier life. You're never satisfied with what you get because you always have an alternative. Limitations are not necessarily bad things. Too much limitation is obviously a bad thing, but having complete what people call freedom is also a bad thing because you don't know what to do. You have no way to measure whether something is good for you or bad for you because it's all the same. It's all you can. There's no way to rank these things. There's no way to sort out the good from the bad as far as you're concerned. So most of the young people I've come in contact with are very confused because they don't know how to make choices. It's the number one thing that the younger people in the workshops would say. It's like, have you got some way that we can, how do we choose stuff? How do we decide what to do? You end up with choice paralysis. You end up with not choosing anything at all and just picking the first thing that comes along because you can't, it's like flipping a coin. You don't know. There's nobody to tell you. It's not politically correct to say that one thing is better than another thing. So, everybody's supposed to be the same, and everybody's supposed to be, have equal opportunities, and everybody's word and everybody's opinion is supposed to be worth exactly the same as everybody else's. So, of course, nobody can choose anything. There's too many opportunities, and there's a lot of regret. Whenever you make a choice, you regret it, and you do not have a good there's no good feeling to be had from whatever it is you do, because you always think you could have done better if you did something else. So this ruins your present moment experience, because you're always living in the past about what you did do, and you're always living in the future about what you're going to do or what you can do next, instead of doing something, concentrating on what you have right now. And this is, of course, a very good place for people who want to sell you things. This is a very good place to have people. And this is what you end up with if you end up with a society which is based on infinite choice. It's a very good place to have people, because you're never satisfied, and so you keep on buying and keep on buying things you don't need in order to fill a big black hole that you think can be filled with things from the outside. So I feel very sorry. I think, especially for teenagers now, I think it's always been difficult to be a teenager. I don't think there's ever been a time when it's been easy to be a teenager, but I think today it must be much, much worse, because you have no guidance. You have no structures to look back on. I mean, most countries, the family is falling apart. Religion is falling apart. All these structures that used to be for good or bad, it doesn't really matter. But there were structures, and you could look to those structures for some sort of guidance, for some sort of, what do I do next? And somebody would say, well, you should do this. But there isn't anybody anymore. There's a bunch of people on the internet who you don't know. That's basically what you have now. Like you say in English, if all you have is a hammer, all of your problems start to look like nails. So if all you've got is infinite choice, and you don't have the possibility to be limited, then you're going to start to, you lack a possibility which actually would be quite beneficial for a lot of people. And that's one of the big things. It's not. I mean, we used to say, oh, well, one of the problems with this world is, we don't have enough information. Well, now we have more information than we could possibly wish. And has that solved all the world's problems? Well, no. So obviously it's not that. It's not access to possibilities. It's not access to information which is going to solve the problems. That's obviously not it. Because if it was, we would see something happening, and what we see is quite the reverse.
Where is this world headed to?
I mean, the best you can say is that, of course, most of these things, I mean, all of these things that happen are cyclical. I mean, they have some kind of, we have this idea that everything, we're told by Western science that everything is going towards entropy. So everything is basically slowing down and getting colder and colder and further apart. But actually, if you look at what's happening, it's not. It's quite the reverse is happening. So I think there are more and more patterns. I think there's less and less chaos. I think there are more and more patterns. It's just that you have to look at it from a different perspective. So I don't think it's possible. I mean, I would be going against everything that I know to be true if I was to say I know what's going to happen. I have no idea. So I'm more than happy to. I mean, I'm quite happy with that, not knowing. I don't have a big need to look into a crystal ball.
What makes you such warm feelings about the art genre of Dadaism? Which artists do you find the most interesting?
Well, the Dadaists, the interesting thing about them was that they were not trying to appeal to rich art patrons like the Surrealists were. The Surrealists were, I mean, Dali found this woman Gala, and she, he was always sucking up to all these very rich people to do their portraits and all this other kind of stuff. I mean, they were society people. They wanted to be accepted by society. They may have seemed like they were rebellious, but they really wanted to be part of rich people's society and upper class and all the rest of it. The Dadaists were basically like skinheads or something. You know, they were uh, they were basically anarchic, but in the proper sense, not just chaotic, but they were very real, and there was this unpredictability was very it was very good. But I have to say that, you know, some years ago I was in Paris and I went to this place called the Centre Pompidou, which is a big art gallery and museum and all the rest of it, and several floors. And there was a big exhibition of Dada art, and they had all, and I mean all of the really famous pieces. So all of the really famous things that you've seen in the books and all of this stuff was all sitting there in these little glass cases. And it was all dead. I mean, it had no life to it anymore. So it's interesting as a historical thing, but everything has a sell-by date, you know, just like a carton of milk that you buy at the supermarket. And art and music is no different. I mean, some things have a very long life and some things have a very short life. And this Dada stuff was a bit like punk. I mean, it was all over in a very short period of time. So there was nothing there which you could say was still alive. It was all very interesting to look at it, you know, but there was nothing living about it. There was nothing vital or anything like that. So you know, so yeah, that's the sort of best I can. But that's what interested me and a lot of people, is that they weren't nice people, and they weren't smooth and sophisticated and all the rest of it. They were very much like. I mean, you could say, you know, it's Dada was like punk and surrealism was like new wave. Well, I mean, Tsara was interesting because he didn't even really fit in with his own creation. But I mean, but from Dada, well, you know, not so much. I mean, there are very few artists now that I think I would bother looking at anymore. So and they're not Dadaists. So I can't come up. I mean, it's like looking at a black and white photograph from your childhood in your grandma's, you know, family album or something, and you sort of remember it, and it's sort of like, oh yeah, that must have happened, but you have no connection to it.
What is your stance on futurism?
Well, I think again, it's interesting as a historical artifact, but again, I don't think there's any life to it right now, and I don't think it has. I don't think you could apply it to what's happening because it's already happened. It's all of a lot of the attitudes that they had have just become, you know, absorbed into something else, which is the way that things happen. I mean, just like with surrealism becoming advertising, and I mean, I even saw in Riga in a shopping center there was a Cafe Dada, and it was like an ordinary cafe that you would see in a shopping mall, and it had like the Dada lettering for the logo. I mean, you know, so everything becomes. I mean, you know, punk has become assimilated. You see this blackmail lettering, you know, everywhere, and you know, you see anarchy signs on people's shoes and stuff like this. I mean, it all becomes part of the mainstream eventually. I'm not an expert. My impression, well, no, I mean, I'm not in contact with these things. My impression is that art has ceased to be a long time ago to have anything relevant at all. So art is just basically another career now. My idea about what an artist was when I was a young thing was that art was supposed to challenge people, and it was supposed to go out into areas that the rest of society wouldn't go, and to come back with reports, to come back with ideas and techniques and experiences that they would translate and give those to people who had not had those experiences. And now all it is a way for people. It's a business and it's a career. So it's no longer what I thought being an artist was. So I don't think the great strides in humanity are coming from art like they once did, maybe. So I think it's in other areas. I don't think it's in the area of art or music at all. So it's just another commodity. It's just another. Uh, I mean, young people will say, "I don't know what I'd want to do for the next. Yeah, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I'll be an artist." And the interesting thing, I mean, I'll give you a concrete example. I mean, when I first moved to Estonia, I taught for 3 months at the art academy in Tallinn, and what was really impressive to me was that all of the people who were studying art had a very old-fashioned attitude towards it. So if they wanted to be artists, they learned to paint. Even if they weren't going to be a painter, they learned to be a painter. And they learned how to do, and then they broke the rules. Whereas in Iceland and Denmark and Sweden and England, you were immediately an artist. You just said, "I'm an artist," and then you just did something weird. And that was it. And what was interesting to me was to see how and later I found out in the rest of the Baltics, it's fading away now, I think, but it was very interesting to see that they still valued the idea of learning the rules before you break them. So, and I mean, I was trained as a classical musician, so I was a classical guitarist and teacher. So there are certain things that if you know the rules and you know the techniques, there's certain things you can do that you cannot, no matter how long you go at it, that you will never hit by random. You will never come across them by random. It's just simply, you'll never get to that floor of the building, you know. But what I'm saying is that there'll be an area of your life that you will never come across. There'll be a part that you will never ever experience. Now there are many, many people who've made a great, wonderful things, being very, very limited and only doing very, very limited things. It's the old thing about the goldfish in the bowl. I mean, we know that the first book about water wasn't written by a fish. If you're always in a particular element and you don't know about something, maybe you don't need to know about it, but at least if you know about it, you can choose not to go there.
What books and films that you've read or seen recently left an impression on you?
Well, most of the things that I read are to do with language. So they mostly about Tibetan language, and recently I've gotten back into. I had to look. Start actually not didn't. I sort of had to start looking at Sanskrit again. So most of the stuff that I look at has to do with either Tibetan or Sanskrit language at the moment, and the stuff that I watch normally has to do with translation, or some aspect to do with that. I mean, I very rarely do. I mean, occasionally I will look for a few minutes or something at something which has nothing to do with that. But most of my time is spent doing this or something related to it. So it's not. Yeah, it's a fairly uninteresting answer, but there we are. I think there are. You see, the thing is that my attitude is always that there may be a small thing. You may have to wait 1.5 hours, and then maybe there's one thing in that film which might be incredibly important. And so, actually, the rest of the film is just an excuse for that one moment. And so, maybe the rest of the film is not valuable at all, but maybe there's that one moment. I'll give you an example. I was teaching in Denmark, and I was showing people how there is a book called The Dice Man, which came out in the late 60s, and it's all about a man who decides to live his life by throwing a dice. So there are six sides on a dice, and he gives himself six options, and whichever one comes up, he's got to do that. And the book is all about that. And it's part true, part fiction. And I was explaining that because I was explaining about creative acts, and this is sometimes a technique that you can use. And I said, okay, we can do this as a class of people. What we can do is we can have six options. What shall we do tonight? All of us. And so, this being Denmark, the first choice was, let's get drunk. Okay, so I wrote that down at number one and number two. And at a certain point, somebody said, go and see the new Michael Jackson film. A film had just come out about Michael Jackson at that time. And there was one guy who was one of the more sort of experimental, rebellious people in the room. And he couldn't, it was like the worst thing he could possibly think of, to go and see Michael Jackson film and how awful this man was. And my God, no, we can't put that up. Anyway, so we got more options. We threw the dice, and guess what? We all had to go and see the Michael Jackson film. So we all went out to this cinema in Aarhus in Denmark, and we went to see this Michael Jackson film. And during this film, I don't remember the exact moment, but something was said in that film, and that man who had protested so loudly about it, it said it changed his life. It completely altered the way that he saw how he did his creative work. And yet he would never have come across it otherwise. It was it was the little tiny thing that he needed. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, or it was the key for the lock, or however you want to call it. And if we had not gone to see that film, that wouldn't have happened, or it would have happened in some completely other way. But this is what I mean. So if I look at something, rather than saying, oh, it's a good film or it's a bad film, I might say, oh, well, there's this one aspect about this particular thing which actually was very useful, and the rest of it wasn't any good. But so you asked me about, did I see any good films or whatever? No, I mean, well, one of the well, of course, there've been many films which I think are wonderful, but they're all different for all different reasons. One of the best ones I saw was, well, it would be mid 1990s, towards the end of the 1990s, and it was made by it was the final piece made by two Czech film students. It was their final project, and called Český sen, which means Czech dream. And it was, well, as you probably know, I mean, in Eastern Europe, when it was still Soviet, the idea of the shopping mall was actually a big thing. And when the fall of the Soviet Union came, all these shopping malls were built, and the idea of shopping represented freedom. So, it was the same thing. So being able to buy different things meant you were free. So this was just at the point where the Czech Republic was deciding whether it should become part of the European Union or not. And so these two they were students at the Prague School of Film. And so for their final project, what they did was they set up a new shopping mall. And they went to a stylist, and they got the clothes, and they were taught how to talk properly. They did advertising. They put leaflets in everybody's door in Prague about this new hypermarket, which was going to be selling all this cheap stuff, but also stuff from the good old days of the Soviet times that people hadn't seen for a long time, and they were going to have those kind of things. And they did a proper advertising campaign with a proper advertising company, and, radio adverts, television adverts, all this kind of stuff. But there was no shopping mall. So come the day of the opening of the shopping mall, thousands of people came, and I won't spoil it by telling you what happens. So it's one of the most remarkable things I ever saw. And it was very relevant when I was living in Iceland, because there was a situation where an American company called Alcoa, which makes the aluminium foil that you use in the kitchen. They basically bought a large part of Iceland in order to flood a valley to make a very large hydroelectric dam, because to make aluminium you need a lot of electricity. So Iceland's a very corrupt country, and or it was. I don't know if it still is. It probably is. And so they basically, without telling anybody, they basically sold a large part of the country. They flooded this valley, and the only protests really came from foreigners. Icelanders thought they were going to get a lot of money by all this investment, this American company coming to Iceland and doing all this stuff, and they didn't eventually. But there was a lot. There were a few people who said, okay, there are a few Icelanders who said, no, this is terrible. We can't allow this to happen, and all the rest. And I said, no, you should watch this Czech Dream film, because they're showing you how to do it. They're showing you how to protest in an intelligent way, where people will actually feel that protest as not just a protest. And it's one of the best. I urge every single person who reads or hears this or whatever to see this film, because it will make you think differently about protesting, and that you can have an effect. Who am I? I'm just this little person. I can't do anything. Well, actually, this film will show you that you can. And it's very, very. I mean, there's many examples like that, but they're generally things where it pulls out the foundations of what you believed was possible and shows you something else. Or there was a documentary some years ago, not so many years ago. It's called Man on Wire. And this is a documentary about a French man who was a tightrope walker. And what he did was, his dream was to walk a tightrope between the Twin Towers in New York City. So this, of course, is totally illegal, and it took him years and years to fix this, to actually sling a wire between the Twin Towers in New York, and he walked it. And of course, they don't exist anymore. But just again, it's just unbelievable to see what one person could actually do with this thing. And it's not just one-sided. It's not just a man does something amazing. It's about it shows you all of the motivations, but also the perversion of it, and also the negative effects that such a thing can happen as well. So it's, well, again, it's. I'm not being difficult. I'm not trying to be difficult anyway. Most of the books which are valuable to me are valuable for reasons that might not be valuable to somebody else. So, yeah, it's difficult, because it's like saying, everybody go and try this food, this particular sort of food, but some people might actually be allergic to that, and some people, their digestion system might not be able to handle it, and there's all sorts of reasons why they shouldn't eat that particular kind of food. It's, I mean, if we're talking about fiction, then it would have to be Raymond Roussel. I mean, you can read pretty much anything by Raymond Roussel, and the top of your head should blow off quite easily. There's someone with a completely unique vision of the world. I suppose Samuel Beckett. God. This is very, very. I mean, you can put J.G. Bennett down, I suppose. I think most people would get something out of reading J.G. Bennett. I can't recommend Gurdjieff, because that's a very difficult subject. Some people would benefit, and some people it would have a very bad effect on them. But J.G. Bennett, probably most people could benefit. from that. Um, I mean, it's yeah. There are there are there are books about technical subjects where I wish people could read it, but they wouldn't be interested in the subject. But simply the way that it is written is an instruction in itself. So it doesn't even matter about what the book is about. There are some people who are able to write in a way which is so careful, is so penetrating, is so illuminating, is so it shows such understanding and gives you so much understanding that it actually doesn't matter what the book is about. So sometimes it's not even the contents of the book, it's actually the way the book has been put together. Can show you so much. Uh, just like if you go to, let's say you have a bicycle. This is from my life when I lived in Amsterdam. There was a bicycle shop, a bicycle repair shop, and it was more expensive than any other bicycle repair shop. But he always had a full shop of people because he loved bicycles so much. And it was a joy to have something go wrong with your bicycle so you could take it to this guy. And it wasn't the fact that it was a bicycle, it was because this man loved what he did so much that it was actually a real education and a pleasure to go in there and have your bike fixed by this man. And there are writers and there are musicians and there are people who make films who is exactly like this. And it doesn't matter what the film is or the book is or the music is. It's the fact, the way that they do it is just so unbelievably good that it wouldn't matter what they were doing. And that's why it's so difficult to answer the question, is because actually, yeah.
How do you feel about poetry? Do you have any favorite poets?
Mm, well, there's very little. I mean, I've never been a big. I've never been a big poetry person, but I have read. I mean, I've read a reasonable amount. But one of the interesting things that, well, okay, I did when I was younger. I read a fair amount of Japanese and Chinese poetry. Uh, because that was, related to my interest in Zen Buddhism and stuff like that. So that naturally came out of it. It wasn't like I went looking for it; it was just there. Um, and I was very interested in Rimbaud, the French poet Rimbaud, for quite some time. Not so much anymore, but what's interesting about poetry is you can't translate it. I mean, that's actually the interesting thing to me about poetry. If you read a good poet, you have to know their language. And what is very relevant to me right now is that I realize that if you are translating poetry, or actually anything else, but especially poetry, is that the translator becomes the poet. You don't translate the poem. What you do is you rewrite it. Well, what was always interesting to me was, because there was this very big relationship between the Russian language and the French language, and you had the royal families in Russia spoke French, and because the structure, not the content, but the structure, apparently, now you can tell me if this is right or wrong, but the structure is quite similar, so it's quite easy to translate from French into Russian and from Russian into French. So I remember being told by a translator that there was, I think it was a novel by Tolstoy, and the first 10 pages are just the names of towns. And he said it was just impossible to translate this. It was just no way could you possibly do this except into French. You could do it into French, but any other language it just wouldn't work. And yeah, well, I mean, now that I've been busy with, Tibetan and to a certain extent Sanskrit and a few other things, the further away you get from any kind of Western language, the harder it gets, because those concepts just do not exist. And this kind of illusion that a lot of people have that there's a sort of a list of words down one side of the page and a list of words on the other side of the page, and you just make a correspondence between one side and the other. You know that your first language is not English, and you know that there are certain expressions in Russian. You can't translate. It's just not. It's just not possible. It's ridiculous to even try. Um, and so, but once you get into the Asian languages, then it just becomes there are certain concepts which you take for granted in Western languages, which just simply do not exist in these Asian languages. There are certain suppositions, there are certain there are certain foundations which you think are reality, and then you find out when you get into these other languages, they're just not there. And this makes it, how do you describe something that that there is no word for at all? I mean, not even the concept. So this makes it more possible for you to realize that your reality is shaped by the language or the languages that you know. Because if you squeeze reality through those concepts that you have, which are built into the language. So if that concept is not there, you don't see it. It doesn't exist for you. I was told quite some years ago by someone who knew the top mathematician in France, or one of the top mathematicians in France. And he said that he and his friend had to speak in English because the concepts that they wanted to speak about did not exist in English. Did not exist in French. Because French is frozen. You're not allowed to bring in foreign words into the French language. There's a special committee that sits there and decides when a new word is needed. So you can't just do what many people do and just use a foreign word and bring it in. You can't do that. So they've frozen it. It's becoming, if we go on a few hundred years, it'll be a bit like Latin. So it'll be a sort of a frozen dead language. So that's one of the things that poetry shows you, is that actually, I think poetry more than any other written form shows you that more clearly than any of the other ones. I mean, the Burroughs example is very, very good. Anything to do with any kind of, any kind of religion. I mean, it's bad enough we can say dog, and we can point to a dog, and we can say, okay, that's what we mean. But I mean, if you're talking about emptiness, or you're talking about, religion or politics or education, you can't point to these things. You can't, there's no way. But you could stretch those words infinitely. I mean, there's no way to define those so that everybody agrees that that's what we're talking about. So hopefully, if you do translation, it makes you a more humble person, because you realize just first of all, what a responsibility it is. The misunderstandings that can happen in translation can have a huge effect on people's lives if something is mistranslated. And, there's plenty of examples in history where that's happened. So the question was about poetry, and poetry can show you that very, very clearly. And it's, if you are learning a foreign language, it's actually very interesting to try and just see how far you get to translate something from a piece of poetry from one language to another. It's just.
What are your current creative plans?
I don't really have any. What I wish was my focus was to do these workshops, but it seems like nobody can organize this, which seems to be a bit weird. But I've been trying for a long time to get the. I mean, I've done them a few times, but the last few years, nobody seems to be able to organize anything these days, except if it's something that people have seen before. So. I'm putting this stuff up, this old stuff, on Bandcamp because I may as well, because it's not going to get released in any other form, but it's not new stuff, and nobody is offering to support any new stuff in that sense. And I'm not particularly interested in doing it anyway, because people don't. People. There are more interesting ways to do this stuff. Like we talked about a little bit before, I don't think you can have the same effect on people as you used to be able to. So my efforts are in other directions, let's say. So
Do you miss your homeland?
Not at all. Not at all. I never felt at home there anyway. So I never even think about it. I mean, the only reason that I bother looking at the news is because of the situation, because I still have a British passport. That's the only reason that I keep up to date with what's going on, because it will actually directly affect me.
Do you have any life motto that you've been following in the recent years?
Uh, it's like one every day or something. I mean, different. I mean, many. One of my favorite ones. One of my favorite ones is, apparently the story is that Marlene Dietrich, the actress, she used to have above her front door, she used to have written, "Es kann auch ohne." It can also be without. So you can also have it without. You can also do without. So which I rather like. Which I think I'm going to use as the title for something which I'm going to do quite soon. So, but, no, I don't have any particular thing which you can put on my gravestone. No,
Are you afraid of death?
not at all. No. I've had all sorts of experiences which actually, well, I mean, I'm not to be dramatic about it, but I mean, no, there's absolutely nothing to be afraid of there at all. No.
And the last question, do you have any message for the people of Earth?
Oh dear, 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 dear. Yes. Again, probably a different one every week. So tune in next week for the next exciting installment of. I don't know. I don't. No, 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 no. I mean, I no. There's no. The entire existence is the message. It's not any particular aspect of it, because it's the entire thing. I mean, you can't separate it. You can't. There's no way to say where something begins and where something ends anyway. So to sum it up in some nice little phrase, you can be clever about it, but I don't think it's amusing. I mean, it's nice to have these little quotes and all the rest of it, but I don't think they. I think they make people lazy. I think they sort of think, oh well, that's the way life is, and I don't think that's very useful. Um, I think it needs to. You need to be questioning, and it doesn't matter whether you get any answers. The answers are not the important thing. It's the questioning which is actually the most important thing. We need better questions. I mean, I don't. You don't need better answers. You need better questions, and that whole idea of that there will be an answer to that will finally cancel out the questions and stuff. This is illusion. There's no way. Uh, and there is I can't remember which saint who said it, but one of the best ones is, "Who am I?" is not a question; it's actually a statement.